Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. I should start this video with a slight apology. I hadn't considered just how long 76 levels and 2 challenge missions would be, and wound up with a lot of footage. So as you can see, this is a pretty long video. I get that this will likely be a point of reference for most people, and that's cool, but props to you if you stick it out all the way. That said, my thoughts on Location 9 are that I liked it overall. Though I'd be lying if I said there weren't a few levels that I found irritating, but I'll get into that in a bit. The highlight for me on this was an instance on Mission 52, where for some odd reason, one of my technician Boscos decided to turn around and leave. So I was like, what the fuck, and couldn't really help but laugh because it looks like he was just like, fuck it, and packed up and left. I'll link it in the timestamp in the description below if you want to see what I'm talking about. So yeah. When I took on this new location, I wanted to do so on 3 conditions. First, I wanted to finish missions with a variety of teams and be able to 3-star each mission with the aim of using every faction in the location at least once at some point. Now, granted, some factions are better than others and I certainly have my favorites, but I did want to utilize them all sooner or later. Second, I wanted to use each faction to its full potential. No mixed rosters, I wanted 5-for-5 team powers in each mission. I'm certain some missions can be done much easier in other ways, but this is sort of my own way of playing the game these days. Lastly, I wanted to do this without using any buffs. No rage, courage, or prep time buffs here, because I'm cheap like that. Actually, I generally use buffs for just messing around, experimenting, and completing the metro where I consume buffs like they're going out of style. By the time I finished this location the way I set out to do, I feel like I gained some better insight and validation on my beliefs on current team strengths and weaknesses. This is helpful because I want to revisit my tier listing for factions soon since my old video doesn't hold up well anymore. Too many changes have been made, too many additions, and well, some mistakes were made on my part that I've since changed my mind on. It's nothing huge, but I definitely want to revisit this in the near future. Anyways, onto Location 9. A lot of it was fun, as I said, and understandably challenging. I think a tremendous source of this challenge was in the early game on certain levels, and players having to contend with the recent nerfs to prep time watches, and the fighter units. Having to wait so much longer to bring out heavy-hitting units was definitely noticeable, and at times frustrating. For me personally, my biggest obstacle and point of irritation was on levels that would barrage you with 3 or more of those escapee zombies in the first 7 to 10 seconds of the mission. I think these zombies are the bane of a lot of players, and I can see why. Truth be told, I really see escapee zombies as the antithesis of the mechanics faction, which is the most commonly thought of, what is commonly thought of as the game's best faction for story missions. I say this because the way the escapee zombie fights just counters everything the mechanics faction does well. Hillbillies get pounded by her attacks. Diaz and Polina are too slow to either get out in time or engage her since she runs pretty quickly. Also, when there are multiple escapees, which is often the case here, they are usually able to run into ranged units quickly unless stopped by a melee unit. And finally, her second form makes her immune to all bullets, including turret fire, so it's everything except from Polina. So that only leaves you with the mechanic himself, whom she counters when she goes into her second form, since he'll have dropped his sledgehammer after the initial hit. It doesn't work the same as it does with prisoner zombies, where they technically die, thereby allowing the mechanic to keep a sledgehammer to pummel the second zombie on the inside. Lastly, her transformation knockback will allow her to start pummeling nearby units or the bus, since it does allow her to gain some ground between transforming and re-engaging melee units. So, the strategy for a lot of people might be just to use hillbillies until her second form and then send out a mechanic to one-shot her blue form. This might work if you have a mechanic with enough melee and crit damage, but the problem of courage arises since doing all that costs a lot of courage the player usually doesn't have at the start, certainly not without using a courage buff being consumed immediately at the start of the mission. Additionally, this strategy does not work when engaging more than one escapee zombie, of which, again, there are many instances of them coming out in pairs or even trios. So basically, if you're trying to plow through this location with the mechanics faction and you're having difficulty, I'd recommend switching to something else if possible. After this playthrough, my own preference for dealing with escapees comes down to one guy plus another, and that one guy is Rodriguez, who I think is the best unit equipped to deal with multiple escapee zombies. He's cheap, on a shortish cooldown, and his crits inflict a knockback. His cost is essential in the early game, and though his prep time has been severely nerfed, it can still be remedied with enough flat second prep time reduction attributes on items. Most importantly, however, is his knockback, which will buy you the crucial time you need early to bring out harder hitting units. So it sort of goes without saying that for this location, Rodriguez needs to be equipped with as much crit chance boosting gear as you have, even if you need to equip the gambling set to bump it up. FYI, as you're watching this, I did these levels with mine, still using boss and having around 42% crit chance. In hindsight, I think I may have fared better with the gambling set, but it's hard to tell since the damage boost from boss is also needed. Alternatively, if you've managed to collect a decent carbon set at this point, that might also fare well. I was lucky enough to get a decent one already, but I put it on my chopper to make him more tanky. But you know, I'm really lazy and I hate switching gear unless I absolutely have to, so I never did switch it up. It is something that's worth exploring though if you have the pieces available. A Rodriguez who has high crit and can mitigate the first couple of hits would do well against this zombie, I think. Units that are good at actually dealing damage to the escapee are just hard hitters that can either tank her second form or pierce through it. My own preference on this would be Polina or Montag since they share the same faction as Rodriguez, but other outside units like the Berserker, Mechanic, and Cashier work well too. I actually find that against these zombies, Cashier does fairly okay since he packs such a punch. My Soldier also does great when I'm able to get him out in time and when he can line up against the escapee. But yeah, again, the missions that start with a bunch of these zombies charging at the bus were the worst ones for me. So, I downplayed the utility of the Mechanics faction quite a bit, which begs the question, who worked out well? I have two teams that I really enjoyed coming back to that are outside the cadre of top tier factions. The first of which is the college team. I found that the two-man rework has really made a big impact on how effective this team is. Funny thing is that prior to the most recent update, for a long time I wasn't putting Coach on my roster since he wasn't really needed. You really only need him to do his boost to units on the field and just sit in the back and not die since his charisma adds to the cheerleader's damage. But since he doesn't do much damage himself, you don't need a level 31 out there. Now, after the update, I do include him on my roster, since ensuring he can churn one out to get that damage boost from his high charisma is so good. I also find that College has a good variety of units that were able to deal with most levels. Turbo Batter fares well against Marauders. Water Boy is good enough in the early game and combos nicely with Farmer and or Sonya. Bully is cheap and his bump in accuracy has been nice. Lastly, being able to get more of them to come out with their 5 for 5 bonus with enough kills has worked out really nicely on missions with a lot of hordes. All in all, I just found this to be a really fun faction to play, and usually they worked out well on more missions than I would have guessed. The other faction I enjoyed using in this location were the Jailers. The nerf to prep time watches just makes their 5-man bonus so much more effective and appealing. I can't tell you how relieved I was to be able to send out a Polina at the start of missions who could start chopping down zombies on time. The addition of Lester to the faction has made a huge difference, and I just found that they could fare well against most matchups. My Jailer unit currently uses Gambling, and with that in effect, he has over 90% chance to stun enemies. Now granted, his stun swing is really slow and that's a huge downside, but with a few of these guys in play, you can just stun lock the shit out of everything and let Lester and Polina clean house. Willie's boost to his hit points is slightly noticeable, but his cost still sucks. However, I do prefer him over the guard simply because I don't want to deal with the guard's undead zombie when he dies. Also, I think the guard is too expensive and really feel that he, along with a few other units, are in severe need of having their cost reduced. In fact, I'd say that he's second only to Pepper in being the most overpriced unit in the game. If I had to rank the top 3 most overpriced units, I'd say that it's 1. Pepper, 2. Guard, and 3. Willie. Pepper's impact on the field does not warrant her costing 25 courage. She really ought to be 15 or even 20, which would put her in line with the gunslinger. That, or she gets a Desert Eagle upgrade and starts pumping out damage like Charlotte. Guard has good stats, and I like his knockbacks, but his health pool and his terrible zombie transformation do not equate to him costing 30. He should be at 25, which would put him in line with 2 similar units like the Light Soldier and Grenadier. Willie has the lowest health pool among the heavyweights and therefore doesn't warrant a 35 base cost. Yeah, I get that he has a shield, but it's a one-time use that can't be replenished. Also, he's unique in that his attacks are ranged and therefore don't cleave. So, with the college and jailers being surprise hits, other factions that worked well in this location are sort of expected teams. Police are excellent, and the combo of using the agents followed by a riot officer are good in the early game. This trio are usually able to kill tough starting zombies with relative ease. Agents are instrumental in one of the challenge missions in the end, I think. At least they made it so much more simple to do for me. Marines were another favorite of mine to use since their roster covers all bases well. They weren't always a valid option, and I found that there were missions where I'd simply get overwhelmed early on because of the prep time nerf, but in a lot of cases I found them to be good. Missions that don't put pressure early on allowed some breathing room for which team I could bring, and of the bunch, I liked using Emergency the most after Jailers. I'll go into this another time, but I found that there are 2 builds to Emergency, a fire build and a heal build. The fire build sucks as it is right now, and therefore you're not going to be using units like Firefighter or Lionheart. The heal build, however, uses both Medic and Nancy, and I found it to be really effective. A Technician Bosco with a Nancy behind his back healing him is nearly impossible to kill. Ice Climber brings some nice melee damage boosts, and Firestarter is probably the year's best skin in my opinion. This guy alone changed this team from a dud to a solid team by bringing in some much needed ranged firepower. I think everyone has their own playstyle, and in this sense I sort of relate this mindset back to my old MMO days playing WoW. People are going to gravitate to playing in a way that makes them ideal to a particular role. For example, some people might enjoy being a defensive tank where they strive to be indestructible in the field, or a DPS style where they want to wreak as much havoc as they can as quickly as they can, or in a healer style where they prioritize getting the most out of their units and keeping them alive and ensuring minimal losses. Of the 3, I find myself attracted to the last, which makes sense since I mained a priest for so many of my days playing Warcraft. I think this is also why I see differing advice here in my channel from time to time. Everyone has their own take, and some people will gravitate towards playing a certain way, which is fine. In fact, doing so and being able to be effective is a hallmark of a good game in my opinion. A game that can accommodate different playstyles and strategies is often one that's simultaneously rewarding and fun. So, in regards to using this emergency team without any fire units, it makes for a powerful team that is a bit slow to roll out, but once it is out, it becomes very difficult to stop. The medpack rework has also been really nice for this faction and makes it much more viable. Speaking of the medpack, the changes that have been made to the IF faction, along with SWAT's cleaner skin, was definitely noticeable. Though I did misunderstand the 5-man faction bonus rework. I thought the medpack was going to tick for damage like it did before, but instead, it puts a debuff on enemies that run into its radius, having them take additional damage, just like the debuff Dr. Kane puts on enemies, right down to having the same appearance as well. All in all, I still don't think that this faction works very well, although the changes made in this recent patch definitely improved its viability. Really though, I just found that IF is too similar in its roster and playstyle as the emergency faction, but it's not as effective without units like Nancy or Ice Climber. Light Soldier and Grenadier are really lackluster in these stages of the game because they don't have a knockback, but can't take very many hits either. so it just kind of makes them for more expensive cannon fodder than anything else. Bastion and Surgeon Lieutenant combo well when she's able to target him with a med pack. She is still very expensive and brittle though, and if it's a level with any Abby or Insectoid zombies, then she's a no-go. In the end, IF still needs their bonuses reworking, and if I were in charge, I would start with the 3-man perk of med packs dropping. I'd either rework it so a pack drops directly onto an allied unit, or near the barricade so enemies are more likely to run into it. Either way, I'd make the drops smarter than they are now. I also would have replaced SWAT with either Sonya or Austin. I don't think SWAT was a good skin for this faction. SWAT is just, or I should say cleaner, is just too inaccurate to be of great use here, despite his high damage output, which really isn't needed when you have the med pack debuffing enemies on the field. That, or just make SWAT slightly more accurate, which is a change I think everyone could appreciate. Not much to my surprise, probably the most lackluster team of them all was the military team. They're just too slow and too weak to be of any effectiveness at this stage of the game. Oddly enough, their best units for this location are the 2 units I swore off as useless, Carol and Modern Grenadier. Carol can take down some of the easier zombies if she has enough melee damage and crit damage, though that gear is better used than other units if you don't have enough of it. Modern Grenadier's grenades do even less than Dr. Miller's landmine, but overall his stats are usually enough to stall the enemy a bit. Juggernaut moves too slow and is just too clumsy. Glenn folds like a house of cards and is nothing more than an activator to spawn in Spec Ops, though Spec Ops himself usually takes too long to deploy, and honestly I wish I could just have him exit the bus like everyone else instead. That really only leaves you with Polina, who takes too long to get out of the bus at the start. It's amazing how an S tier PvP team winds up being an F tier in story missions on this location. Also, their 5-man bonus doesn't really do much for them in these kinds of missions. Really, this is a faction that's best left to skirmish mode. Builders was another team I didn't use that much of, but not for really any horrendous reason. I just found that they usually don't sync well together. It seems that every time I use them, they take a long time to overcome the enemy. As they are now, their roster is just too diverse for their team bonuses to be of any use. That, combined with the fact that spawning level 0 units who aren't on your active roster is completely useless and therefore an additional gamble, which just sucks. They're strongest with more members on their roster, but they also need units outside their faction like Agents, Nancy, or Maria to boost their staple units. At the very least, they should be able to spawn units as they're equipped outside your active roster so their bonuses aren't wasted. With the most recent patch, they added 2 new set pieces, Piercing and Carbon. Of the 2, I like Carbon more, and I actually think it makes for a very good tanking set. There are a few characters I think this might work well on too, not least of which is Cashier, who suffers from being a bit squishy. Yeah, he won't get that 50% damage boost from Gentleman, but if he's able to get in a few more swings and stall the front line a bit longer, then it might be worth it, depending on your roster lineup. Fighter units like Rodriguez might also benefit, as I previously mentioned, making him akin to Jailer's prisoner skin with a 2-man faction bonus. Piercing sets secondary damage number of 30% just doesn't seem like it's worthwhile unless you have multiple ranged units using it on a level that has a lot of clustered zombies. It's also very niche and possibly redundant since melee units already have cleave. However, a unit like Willy, who engages in close range combat but still uses ranged attacks, might benefit from this set if you have one with enough flat range damage. But then again, this is a pretty big stretch, and I'd say it's worth exploring only if you're a fan of the big guy. But I don't have a good one yet, so this is just speculation. I do think that a burgeoning problem with these 2 new sets is their method of acquisition. Since they're very limited in number, and they either show up in 2 different qualities, it makes getting a good set difficult. I think this is Moby-Rate's answer to how useless the reroll tokens have been. Now, instead of just wasting them away trying to reroll stats and items that would just be better off acquired through a key, Instead, you need to use these tokens on items that are very limited in supply. I find it sort of to be a cheap response to the token. It would have made so much more sense to just allow the item to retain its current level instead of resetting it back to 1. Let me know what you think about that in the comments. As you can see here on level 30, we have encounters with one of the new enemies, the Brute. He's the marauder that turns into the other new zombie, the Tough Blue. You need to be a bit careful about him since he's a zombie that boasts 2 high hit point forms, with his second being a lot tougher than his first. The Tough Blue's AoE attack seems to only happen once he's engaged by either a fighter unit or by more than one melee unit. He's not too bad, at least not compared to the escapee, but you definitely don't want them getting too close to the bus either, or they'll definitely get a hit in or two. I actually think he's a very cool new addition, and a suitable counter to the popular Zerg strategy of flooding the area with rednecks, psychos, or mechanics. As of this location, he's not overtuned in my opinion, and makes for good fit here. The locust zombies you see on this level have been an annoyance for me ever since I encountered them. They often get the initial hit on most units, and on the Metro I found them to be a bit irritating. Not the worst zombie, but definitely one I don't like encountering in large numbers either. This is a mission where I was testing out the scout set since it got a slight buff from 2 to 3 seconds in duration. It's still slightly underpowered, but I do like having it on turbo. I frequently switch between this set and a Swiss made set that has a ton of Valor on it so I can get good knockbacks with her on the appropriate levels. I have to say, it's weird seeing Marauders so deep into this location since I didn't think I'd see them again after location 8. I do hope they dive more into the story on this game and explain their purpose a bit, like, it doesn't make sense to them to house so many infected people, and I'm curious as to their reasoning behind it. Maybe there's some kind of mind control going on, who knows? I can tell I got really lucky here in this first wave of locusts since they all came out around the same spot so this Montag could kill them all at once. If that didn't happen, I'd probably have to start by sending out a bunch of Rodriguez first to try and knock them back before sending out a red streak to blast them. As it went though, all went well here. Although I like this location, I do think it feels a bit lacking in overall aesthetic design. It's all very overdone with sepia color tones and it's a bit too focused on the same color themes. I also missed little goodies like cars you could crack open to get new items. I wish they added more interactive objects here because it seems like the frequency of those things really drop off after location 6. Given how long it took to come out with this location, I'm slightly disappointed there wasn't more of this kind of thing. Something I find odd about Dr. Lily is how he doesn't have any poison resistance. With a look like that, you'd think he'd be 100% poison and even explosion proof. I didn't really get into Psychos earlier, but I think they've done really well with the new additions of Beetle and Ma Rebecca. They still suffer from a difficult early start since their quickest courage costing units have a prep time of 35. To compare to this, most damager units have prep times ranging between 10 to 20 seconds, so that just goes to show how slow of a start they still have. Also, you might need to align the amount of range so Austin stays inside Ma Rebecca's aura buff if you're using them together. Still, they're a really fun faction to play and I really enjoyed using them, and they weren't at all bad on these levels on the missions that did allow you to have the time in order to get out your starting units. A Carol who has enough melee and crit damage can be an absolute beast on Marauder missions. including metro missions where under the right circumstances, she can clear those stages in mere seconds. It does take a bit of luck though, and sometimes you need a few tries to do it, but definitely worthwhile. If you haven't yet seen it, you should watch the cutscene for this location since they get a bit into the story. It's the first cutscene where you see characters talking outside the bus, and there they mention the scientists and how they plan to head north to meet up with them. I'm glad they're developing the story more, and I actually look forward to seeing where they go with this. It'd be cool to get some fresh new units that are in that faction, but given how many they already have, that might be unlikely. I would love to see Lionheart or even Firefighter get a scientist skin though, since they have explosion resist and immunity respectively. Toxic fog missions were pretty abundant in this location, which makes me wish that they made more use of the new snowstorm effect instead. I don't mind this effect so much, but it really just meant that for most people, they're going to use rednecks as a counter, which is what I did whenever I encountered one that was really difficult. I think maybe 1 or 2 of these missions I used factions that had poison resistant units like TMF and Emergency, but those missions weren't too hard to begin with. I'm fortunate enough to have collected all skins and units now. As for skins that are unlocked through blue tokens and money, if you're at all curious, the Ranger's TMF skin was the second last skin I purchased, with Patriot's Carol being the last. I think what put me off TMF Ranger is the fact that he doesn't have the same bonuses as other TMF units have, like not turning into a zombie. He is a good unit for the faction though, and if you're into TMF, he's well worth having. I just find I don't play the faction much these days because I find them pretty lacking since they've been nerfed into the ground in my opinion. Here's a good example of just how powerful the recently buffed Charge Zombie has become. It only took 2 of them to basically kill off my Juggernaut, which to me is downright criminal. I think maybe this was a move to possibly make barrels more useful again, since putting them behind the barricade is a good counter to these zombies. 45 was a mission that gave me quite a bit of trouble, and I found a lot of factions I had been using, such as Rednecks and Marines, weren't cutting it. Riot Officer, with his shield from the 3-man police faction bonus, does really well against escapees, but the only problem is that you can't spam him out on missions where multiple escapees pop out. This means you either have to change your roster or hope that the level will have escapees come out relatively close to each other. Either way, this mission was a bit of a pain for me, though maybe not the worst one. There's little doubt that the turret is the best support item in the game, but in my opinion, there are very few things that can top a good nitro chank drop as well. If you're having trouble on missions, sometimes the trick isn't to change up your units, but instead try out a different support item. You might be pleasantly surprised at the results. "47 is a mission I like because the combinations of zombies encountered is so different from previous levels. It was cool to see more of the Lionheart zombie on this mission, and that, combined with the toxic fog effect, made it pretty interesting for me. If I recall correctly, there is a zombie movie out there where the zombie virus is spread through the air and the only people left have to wear gas masks. I can't remember the title, but I think it was filmed in Australia by a smaller film company, must have been about 15 years ago maybe? It's something that's been visited a few times in films, for me most notably with Cloverfield Lane, which was probably my favorite one of the trilogy. I think Abby zombies are much more preferable to insectoids. Even though they have the same mechanics, it just seems like Abby zombies aren't quite as aggressive as insectoids and don't start melee attacking your units as quickly as they do. This is a good demonstration as to what I was talking about earlier in regards to Rodriguez being a good counter to escapee zombies. He's not always outrightly able to kill them, in fact he rarely does, but he is able to delay them long enough for you to pull out someone else who is able to kill them off. I'm not a fan of Firefighter, but as far as emergency goes, he's the only one you can get out the door relatively quickly. I'm praying their next unit is a more sturdy melee unit, that or he gets a much needed buff. Either one works, but I just don't like using him as he is now unless I have to. The missions that had a constant stream of puffer zombies coming at your bus were really annoying, and after that prep time nerf, it sort of felt like a slap in the face. 54 is probably my favorite mission of the location. There was just something smooth and easy about this mission, and I've since been using this stage to test out new builds and combinations. Very fun, and well worth repeating in my opinion. "57 is potentially a very tricky mission. However you come at this, my advice is to not use any ranged units whatsoever at all from start to finish. Mechanics might work if you have a very good one, not sure. But in my opinion, the hardest zombie to tackle was the two-headed blue zombie since they took such a pounding to bring down. Either way, again, don't use ranged units unless you're very good at setting up insectoids for a trap. But then again, it's quite a risk to run. As you can see here, this was definitely a war of attrition." This is a good example of what I was talking about earlier about the Bosco-Nancy combo. Even slowed down, they still can't be beat. These two together are easily my favorite pair of units on the field. I tell ya, watching these guys go gives me the same feeling a father gets watching his kid hit a home run in T-ball. I didn't get much into Patriots, but I used them a lot more than I thought I might. Montag was the necessary ingredient everyone knew was needed to make this faction actually work, though they still suffer from having really bad team bonuses aside from the 3-man one. They might just have the worst 5-man bonus in the entire game in my opinion. In my previous video, I talked briefly about the change to the cinema and how it's been reduced to an 8-hour cooldown instead of the old 24-hour cycle. This, combined with the fact that it now rewards 100 blue tokens, has really made collecting skins a lot easier through tokens alone. If you were diligent about completing the cinema ads every 8 hours and doing the daily missions, you'd collect 350 tokens each day. However, given that for most people that's unrealistic, it's still possible to do the cinema twice a day and still get 250 tokens. That's a new skin every 20 days. Less than that if you're also purchasing tokens from the event shop and the skirmish shop. So at the very least, this recent update has implemented a nice catch-up mechanic to help players collect the skins they want for their team. Twin zombies might be my favorite zombie in the game. There's just something so creepy about a pair of zombies who are attached to each other, along with the fact that one is immensely deformed and uses a club. I also like the zombie that has a huge chunk of its head missing. I forget the name, but he's wearing some fatigues, I think. Something I think that is missing from the game is a zombie that eats the corpses of your fallen units. It'd be cool to see a zombie eat anyone who's died and not burning in order to gain health or a power up. So MobiRay, if you're watching this, there's my idea for you. So long as he's not the target of blue spheres, Cashier is a solid choice for chopping down eggs, which are one of my most hated enemies in the game. I'm still eagerly awaiting for the day Cashier finally gets assigned to a faction in the hopes it will make him broken. If you haven't gotten him from the Christmas event yet, just know he is sort of a mix between rogue and mechanic. He has a higher damage output than the rogue, but is much more squishy. He has the highest base crit chance in the game, and once powered up, the highest crit damage. This sort of makes him similar to a mechanic that never loses his sledgehammer, except in Cashier's case, he swings much slower, which is his biggest downside. That's a lot, but hopefully you could find something helpful in these missions to get you through some of the tougher missions in your game. That's all I have for this video. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.